I am so sick of this conversation, but here it goes. Reparations. King Charles and Sir Keir Starmer are set to face a demand that the UK pays £200 billion in compensation for its role in the transatlantic slave trade. 15 Caribbean governments have decided to put slavery reparations on the table at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Samoa later this month. Of course they have. Who doesn't like being given pots of money because they believe they've been wronged? UN Judge Patrick Robinson even called the £200 billion figure an underestimation of the damage caused by the trade. He said that he was amazed that countries involved in slavery think that they can bury their heads in the sand on the issue, and stated once a state has committed a wrongful act, it's obliged to pay reparations. You know what this is, don't you? They've seen how woeful and weak our government is. They've watched Foreign Secretary David Lammy flippantly hand back the Chagos Islands, Labour using their vast majority to get policies through unchallenged. And these countries have thought, we're onto something here. David Lammy has also in the past said that he would take the responsibility of being the first Foreign Secretary descended from the slave trade incredibly seriously. He said that his Guyanese parents would not have believed their skinny son in NHS prescription glasses, who got stopped and searched on the streets of Tottenham, could end up reaching the Foreign Office. Sorry, but this sounds a little bit like we're in sort of chip-on-shoulder territory. That's just my view. David also tweeted, in 1833, Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act, £17 billion of compensation to slave owners for the loss of their property. My ancestors, the slaves, received no reparations. Some people simply do not know their history or do not want to know hard truths. OK, let me give you some hard truths, David. Even if we were to agree to reparations, who do we pay? Just because my skin is considered black doesn't mean I am one of the wronged party. This country is also full of people from all nations. Should they contribute to the pot paid just because they live and work in the UK? I mean, where do you think the money's going to come from? And for those receiving the funds, for all we know, they might be descendants of slave owners, because the trade did not happen without the cooperation of many from those very nations demanding the reparations. Unless we're all prepared to take a DNA test first so we can work out what our actual ancestry is and whether they were friend or foe to the trade, or whether many demanding reparations are in fact even Caribbean, then how do we ascertain who gets what? You see, the problem with this is that not all Caribbeans are innocent. Being black doesn't make it so. Many benefited from the slave trade, and to carte blanche blame it on the UK and demand a ludicrous sum is frankly naive. And I don't see why I, as a Ghanaian descendant born in Newcastle, living in the UK, should pay a penny towards it. And whilst the slave trade was an abhorrent, vile business, it brought some benefits to those nations. Have you factored that into the calculation, David? Ironically, it's not black and white. So what is it, the history of slavery reparation demands? Right, I'm joined now by author and historian Martin Whittock. Martin, welcome to the programme. So Martin, lovely to have you on board. So Martin, talk to me. Why is there this constant demand from different nations for reparations when really it's almost impossible to work out what to give whom, if there is any blame to be attributed?
Well, as you say, it's certainly very, very complicated. But just to give people some sort of background in this, the moral and economic case that is made is that by the beginning of the 19th century, it's thought that the British GDP benefited about 11% of that GDP because of slavery. So effectively, about 11% of the gross British domestic product in the beginning of the 19th century was generated by people who over 200 years had provided unpaid slave labour. The second factor is that, as David Lammy pointed out, in 1833, a huge loan was taken out. The British government took out a huge loan and it repaid the slave owners, but it didn't compensate the slaves. And people may be shocked to discover that that was still being paid off as late as 2015. So we have a background in which the British economy, as other advanced economies, certainly gained huge advantage by unpaid labour, in our case, particularly in the Caribbean, and that the British government after government, was paying basically reparations, but to slave owners as late as 2015. And of course, nobody ever complained about that. So that's what this is the background to this. People saying, well, shouldn't there be some kind of recompense now for those communities that were damaged by slavery? That's what the debate's all about.
But Martin, weren't some of those slave owners black? And some of them were from the Caribbean. So when you realise that not all of them were from the UK, how do you then determine who to give what, if you are even going to do that? Because some of those compensated would have been black owners.
Certainly in West Africa, for example, as you rightly alluded to, the situation was extremely complicated, because there we have people like the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British and others actually negotiating with some West African tribes who, of course, had enslaved people from further inland in Africa. Certainly in West Africa, it's highly complicated. In the Caribbean, I think it's less complicated because, without a shadow of a doubt, most of the economy there was driven by unfree labour. Now, there would have been some people who benefited from it who were mixed race, but certainly the majority of people that provided the unfree labour were black. And what happened afterwards was it was replaced by a system of indentured labour, by which even when they were freed in 1833, they were having to provide a great deal of input into the West Indian and Caribbean economy. Basically, they weren't being paid the market rate by any means whatsoever. While at the same time, of course, compensation was going to the slave owners, not to the slaves. And that's the argument, that basically these communities have started so far behind because of treatment, particularly in the Caribbean, that something needs to be done now in order to bring them up to a level that's at least approaching some kind of equity, really.
Yeah, but wouldn't some of the slaves have built infrastructure and things like that? There would be some sort of benefit to the people in those countries. And also, lots of people who are Caribbean and other descendants live in this country. So ultimately, the money that will be used to compensate them would be, the British taxpayer would be paying for this, surely. So if, for example, I was one of the people who was enslaved, or one of my descendants, I'm now paying money through my taxes to then pay for people who in another country for slavery. It's too complicated.
You're certainly right in saying it's massively complicated.
It's too complicated, it doesn't work.
Yeah, well, indeed, it might not work. What I think is necessary, though, is I think that former slave-owning countries like ourselves, like France, like Spain, like other countries, do need to think about where their foreign aid budget is going, to what extent it's making up for the kind of damage that was done by slavery. But I think when calculating that kind of figure, it also has to be taken into account what has been given in foreign aid since 1945, because clearly that's part of the global picture. So I think we in the wealthy North, we often say the West, do have a responsibility to assist people in the global South, or in this case in Caribbean, because they have suffered from the kind of behaviour that's happened in the past. But we do also have to take into account things that have been done in the last generation or so to try to recompense. So I don't think it's simple as saying we're starting from zero now. I think there needs to be some kind of contribution, so there needs to be some kind of engagement, but we do have to recognise at the very least the extreme complexity of it, as you pointed out.
And how far back do we go? Because they can start there, but we could go further back when other people were enslaved and so on and so forth. But do you know what I mean? It doesn't. Yeah. None of it makes any sense. In your view, how far back should we go?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, obviously, there comes a point at which you have to say, well, how far into history can you sort of right the wrongs?
Exactly.
The only reason why I would say something about the transatlantic slavery and the current day is particular and peculiar is because in many ways the Industrial Revolution was driven by this kind of slavery, was assisted by the kind of slavery, and we live in that kind of world. So I would say the kind of world that we live in 2024 is one that's been directly related to the world that emerged after, let's say, 1750, 1760. And I think we are peculiarly connected. I think once you go back beyond that, it gets very, very difficult. But I think we are part of that modern world, if you like, that post-industrial world, which certainly did benefit. I mean, certainly in this country, although my ancestors were working class, so obviously not a lot of the money flowed to them. But certainly people in institutions and in landowners in this country and elsewhere did benefit greatly. And I think it's that kind of conversation that needs to go on. But it doesn't have simplistic answers, as you rightly pointed out.
And also the Industrial Revolution saved many, many lives, including many in those countries as well. Listen, Martin Whittock, really good to talk to you. Thank you very much for your insight into that topic. That's author and historian Martin Whittock.